It was a cold October evening in Detroit, 2023. The kind of night where the city seemed to hold its breath, the streets dimly lit, the hum of life slowing to silence. But on the west side, in a modest two-story duplex, that silence was shattered. Neighbors dialed 911 in a panic. They reported gunshots, shouting, a man's voice cutting through the night. Police units sped to the scene, sirens screaming, lights flashing red and blue against the cracked sidewalks. Within minutes, officers pushed through the unlocked front door and stepped into a living room thick with tension and dread. There, on a worn-out sofa, sat the body of Sandra Grant, just 30 years old. Her head slumped forward, her chest riddled with bullets. Blood pooled into the fabric, a life extinguished in seconds. And across from her, in an armchair, sat her husband, Marcus Grant. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't screaming. No, he was sitting perfectly still, staring at a dog collar clutched tightly in his hands. On the coffee table before him, resting in eerie calm, was a .38 caliber revolver, its barrel still warm, 3 spent casings in its chamber. The officers raised their weapons, shouting commands. But Marcus didn't resist. Slowly, almost absently, he raised his empty hands. His eyes never left the collar. And then came the words. Words that froze every man in uniform in that room. She killed my dog, so I killed her. Flat. Cold. Without hesitation. It was a confession drenched not in passion, but in grim certainty. A sentence that revealed both the motive and the madness. What kind of love, what kind of obsession, what kind of bond could drive a man to such a brutal act? The truth, as investigators would soon learn, was more twisted than anyone could imagine. Because Sandra Grant hadn't killed the dog at all, the animal was still alive, safe, waiting in a shelter just a few miles away. Sandra had staged it. She had surrendered the animal, cooked a pot of beef soup, left its collar on the floor, and then delivered a cruel taunt meant to break her husband's spirit. I cooked your dog. Sit down and eat. Those words were enough to snap Marcus Grant in two. Enough to send him into the bedroom, to the cabinet where he kept his revolver. Enough to pull him back into the living room, where he fired 3 shots into his wife's chest, ending her life before she could even flinch. This is not a story of self-defense. This is not a story of a crime of passion. This is a story of cruelty, of deception, of love twisted into obsession, and a husband who chose bullets over truth. And it begins with a dog, a marriage on the brink, and a single lie that cost a woman her life. Before the gunshots, before the shouting, before the blood on the sofa, there was just a man, a dog, and a fragile hope for comfort. Marcus Grant had never been the loudest man in the room. At 31, he'd spent most of his adult life hauling bricks, swinging hammers, and tearing down walls on construction sites across Detroit. He was a reliable worker, yes, but distant. The kind of man who showed up, did his shift, and slipped out without a word. To his co-workers, Marcus was steady but withdrawn, a man who kept his thoughts to himself. Loneliness was his constant companion. Bills piled up, hours at work were inconsistent, and at home, his marriage to Sandra was strained, brittle, full of sharp words and long silences. Then, one ordinary afternoon on a demolition site, something extraordinary happened. A skinny stray dog wandered onto the lot, its ribs pressed against its coat, eyes wide with hunger. While the crew laughed and shooed away, Marcus didn't. Instead, during his lunch break, he tore off a piece of his sandwich and set it on the ground. The dog crept forward, cautious at first, but then ate with desperate speed. And from that day on, the dog never left him. Every lunch break, there it was, waiting for Marcus like clockwork. It followed him from one end of the site to the other, tail wagging, eyes shining with loyalty. It didn't care about his silences, his mood, or his empty wallet. It just wanted to be near him. Weeks passed, and Marcus began saving scraps just for that dog. He started calling it Buddy. And one day, when the shift ended and the crew packed up, Marcus opened the door of his truck, and Buddy hopped inside. From that moment, Marcus wasn't alone anymore. At home, the dog trailed him from room to room, curled up by his feet, and waited by the door whenever he left for work. When Marcus spoke, Buddy listened. When Marcus sat quietly, Buddy rested his head against his leg as if to say, I'm here. You matter. For Marcus, Buddy wasn't just a pet. He was salvation. The only soul who seemed to understand him. But not everyone in the Grant household welcomed this new addition. Sandra saw things differently. To her, Buddy wasn't comfort. He was filth. He was mess. He was another mouth to feed in a home already drowning in overdue bills. Neighbors later told detectives that Sandra never hid her disdain. She complained constantly about the smell, the shedding fur, the money wasted on kibble and vet visits. To her, Buddy was a burden, not a blessing. And in that difference, in that clash between Marcus's quiet love and Sandra's simmering resentment, the seeds of destruction were planted. What had begun as a fragile lifeline for Marcus soon became a wedge, driven deep into their already fractured marriage. Arguments began to erupt. At first, they were sharp exchanges over money, groceries, rent. But slowly, inevitably, they circled back to the dog. "Get rid of him, Marcus," Sandra snapped more than once. "We can't afford this. He's all I've got," Marcus would mutter, clutching Buddy's collar. Neighbors overheard heated words on the porch, Sandra threatening to toss the dog onto the street, Marcus defending him with rare bursts of anger. And then, the threats escalated. Sandra's tone grew crueler. She began to taunt Marcus with a promise darker than neglect. One of Marcus's friends later recalled a chilling conversation. Sandra had told Marcus, "One day, I'll cook that dog. I'll serve him to you in a pot." At the time, Marcus dismissed it as venom, another cruel remark in a crumbling marriage. He never believed she'd mean it. He never believed she'd push him that far. But words, once spoken, have a way of lodging deep inside. And those words would echo louder and louder, until the night they became the spark that set off the fire. For a while, the Grants tried to carry on as if nothing had changed. Marcus worked his shifts, Buddy waited at the door, and Sandra simmered. But cracks were spreading across their marriage, cracks too wide to ignore. The arguments started small. Whispers behind closed doors, Sandra's voice rising about the bills stacked on the counter, about the leaky faucet still dripping in the kitchen, about the empty fridge. "Marcus, we can't even pay rent on time, and you're buying dog food?" "He's family, Sandra." "Family? He's a mutt. He's a waste." Neighbors began to notice. The thin walls of the duplex did little to hide the sound of raised voices. Witnesses later told detectives they'd hear Sandra shouting on the front porch, words carried into the night. "You care more about that dog than you do about me." Sometimes Marcus shouted back. More often, he didn't. His voice was low, steady, clinging to the same line again and again, "He's all I've got." But Sandra wasn't done. Her bitterness cut deeper with each passing week. She complained to relatives that Marcus had lost his mind over a stray. She told friends she felt trapped, that Buddy was driving a wedge into the home. And then, the threats began. At first, they sounded like empty barbs hurled in anger. "I'll put him on the street, Marcus. Don't test me." But the more she said it, the sharper the words became. One neighbor recalled hearing her sneer from the porch, "Keep pushing me, and I'll cook that dog. I'll put him in a pot and watch you cry." Most people dismissed it as spite, cruel words said to wound. But Marcus didn't laugh. He didn't brush it off. He tucked those words into the back of his mind, where they festered like poison. Behind the scenes, friends noticed Marcus growing quieter. He seemed distracted at work, staring at nothing during lunch breaks, his hand absently brushing the dog's collar in his pocket. When asked if things at home were okay, he would mutter, "She hates him. She hates that he makes me happy." The divide inside the duplex deepened. Sandra saw Buddy as a rival for attention, a symbol of everything she despised about their strained life. Marcus saw Buddy as his only anchor, the last spark of loyalty in a world that felt cold and uncaring. It was more than just a marriage in trouble. It was a ticking bomb. And like all bombs, it only needed one spark. That spark would come on the night of October 14th, 2023. Marcus would return from work tired, hungry, expecting Buddy's wagging tail at the door. Instead, he'd find silence. An empty space where his companion should have been. A collar on the floor. And a wife with a smirk on her lips, ready to deliver the cruelest words of all. Words that would push him past the edge. Words that would turn arguments into murder. It was Saturday evening, October 14th, 2023. The autumn chill had begun to creep across Detroit, the sun dipping low behind rows of duplexes on the city's west side. Marcus Grant pulled into the narrow driveway, tired from another long shift at a demolition site. Dust clung to his boots, his hands raw from labor. But in his heart, there was one thought, one comfort that carried him through every grueling day. Buddy. Usually, the moment Marcus opened the front door, the little dog bounded toward him, tail wagging furiously, eyes bright with devotion. It was their ritual, his one reason to smile. But tonight, silence. No bark. No scampering paws. No warm greeting. Instead, the living room felt eerily still. And there on the worn linoleum floor, Buddy's collar. Just lying there, as if torn from the dog's neck. Marcus froze. His breath caught in his throat. He bent down, picking up the collar with trembling hands, his chest tightening. On the sofa, Sandra sat casually, the glow of the television flickering across her face. She didn't even look at him when she spoke. "You're looking for that mutt?" she asked coolly. Marcus's voice cracked. "Where is he?" Sandra tilted her head toward the kitchen. Her lips curved into a cruel half-smile. "Go look." Confused, Marcus stepped into the kitchen. On the stovetop sat a large pot, steam curling from its rim. A spoon rested on the counter, drops of broth staining the surface. He leaned closer. Inside, chunks of meat floated in the simmering liquid. And then came the words that would shatter everything. From the living room, Sandra's voice rang out, mocking, taunting, deliberate. "I cooked your dog. Sit down and eat." Marcus's vision blurred. His pulse pounded in his ears. His grip tightened on the collar still in his hand. The room spun as rage surged through him, hot and blinding. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. Instead, he turned on his heel, walked into the bedroom, and opened the cabinet. Inside, waiting in silence, was his revolver, a .38 caliber, legally registered, the weapon he had bought years earlier for protection. His hands moved as if controlled by something outside of him. He loaded it, stepped back into the living room, and saw Sandra still lounging on the sofa, unarmed, unconcerned, her smirk unbroken. Marcus raised the gun. 3 deafening shots rang out. 1, 2, 3. Each round tore into her chest, forcing her body back into the sofa. Blood bloomed across her shirt, dark and heavy, seeping into the fabric. Her eyes widened, but only for a moment, before her body went limp. The TV still played. The pot still simmered. But Sandra Grant was gone. Outside, neighbors jolted upright. They had heard the shouting, the woman's mocking words, and then the gunfire. 1, 2, 3 cracks in rapid succession. Some stepped onto their porches. Through the window, they saw Marcus pacing, clutching something in his hand. Then, slowly, he sank into the armchair across from Sandra's body. When police stormed through the unlocked door minutes later, they found him there. Not fleeing, not hiding, just sitting quietly, holding Buddy's collar in both hands. On the coffee table in front of him, the revolver rested, 3 spent casings in its chamber, 2 rounds still unfired. Officers raised their weapons, barking commands. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't move until they told him. Then, calmly, almost absently, he set the collar on his lap, lifted his hands, and surrendered. When asked what had happened, he didn't hesitate. His voice was flat, lifeless. "She killed my dog," he said. "So I killed her." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Cold. Final. Paramedics rushed to Sandra, but there was nothing left to save. 3 shots at close range had ended her life instantly. And Marcus? He never took his eyes off that collar. The living room became a crime scene. Yellow tape stretched across the doorway, the air heavy with the metallic tang of blood and the hum of police radios. Officers moved methodically, photographing, measuring, collecting. On the sofa, the lifeless body of Sandra Grant, marked by 3 bullet wounds. On the coffee table, the .38 revolver, cylinder open, 3 casings spent, 2 rounds still loaded. In Marcus's lap, Buddy's collar, clutched like a relic of faith betrayed. Detectives Howard Price and Carla Stevens were assigned the case that very night. Both seasoned investigators, both accustomed to tragedy. But even for them, Marcus's words were chilling. "She killed my dog, so I killed her." At first glance, it looked simple. Brutal, yes, but simple. A domestic argument spiraled out of control. A beloved pet lost. A husband consumed by rage. A wife executed on her sofa. But the truth was not so simple. Not at all. Crime scene technicians swept through every room. In the kitchen, they seized the pot still simmering on the stovetop, ladling samples of broth and meat into sterile containers. They bagged the utensils, swabbed the counter, even scraped residue from the stove's burners. Everything was tagged, sealed, logged. Neighbors were interviewed on porches under the harsh beam of cruiser headlights. One reported hearing Sandra yell, "I cooked your dog," moments before the shots. Another confirmed weeks of bitter arguments about that mutt. Their stories aligned. The dog was always at the center of the storm. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in the back of a patrol car, wrists cuffed, collar pressed to his chest. He repeated the same line to every officer who asked, "She killed my dog. So I killed her." No excuses. No hesitation. At Detroit Homicide, Detectives Price and Stevens pressed him further. Why hadn't he checked the pot more closely? Why hadn't he looked for the dog before pulling the trigger? Marcus's answer was chilling in its simplicity. She said he was in the pot. That was enough. His demeanor was flat. Heavy. Not defiant. Not remorseful. Simply broken. But as Marcus repeated his confession, something unexpected was happening in the lab. The samples from the soup pot were being tested, fast-tracked because of the bizarre nature of the claim. And when the results came back, everything changed. The meat in that pot? Beef. Not canine. No trace of Buddy's DNA. Detectives chose not to confront Marcus immediately. Instead, they dug deeper. They contacted Detroit Animal Care and Control, providing a description of the stray. The answer came swiftly and stunned them all. 2 days earlier, on October 12th, Sandra Grant had walked into the shelter. Surveillance cameras captured her signing paperwork, handing over a small dog. Intake forms bore her signature and the address of the duplex. The animal had been scanned for a microchip, and yes, it was registered to Marcus Grant. The dog was alive, healthy, safe in a kennel. Sandra hadn't killed Buddy at all. She had staged it. Every cruel word, every taunt, every mocking order to sit down and eat. It was all part of a plan to provoke Marcus. Detectives now had a clearer picture. Sandra had grown bitter enough to act out her threats. She surrendered the dog, left its collar in the living room, and purchased beef from the local market to reinforce her deception. A receipt confirmed the purchase less than an hour before Marcus came home. And then, the final nail. A voice memo on Sandra's phone, sent to her sister just hours before the shooting. "He thinks that mutt matters more than rent. I'm dropping it at the shelter. Let's see him cry." It was cruelty caught on tape. Sandra had engineered the perfect emotional trap. She wanted to hurt Marcus, to strip away the one thing that gave him comfort. And in doing so, she lit the fuse that would blow their fragile marriage and her own life apart. But as deliberate as Sandra's deception had been, detectives knew one truth remained unshakable. Marcus had made his choice. He had time to think. He had walked into another room, opened a cabinet, armed himself, and returned to fire 3 fatal rounds at close range. Sandra's cruelty may have set the stage, but Marcus pulled the trigger. And that, under the law, was murder. Detectives Howard Price and Carla Stevens laid out the evidence across the table. Photos of the living room. The revolver with 3 spent casings. The soup pot, ladled into sterile bags. The collar Marcus had clutched in his fists. And then, a picture of Buddy, alive, safe, staring out from a kennel at Detroit Animal Care. The story had shifted. The narrative was no longer about a man whose beloved dog had been slaughtered. It was about a woman who staged a deception so cruel, so calculated, that it shattered her husband's already fragile stability. Sandra Grant had not killed the dog, but she had wanted Marcus to believe she did. Why? Was it desperation? Bitterness? A need to prove that she held the power in their crumbling marriage? Or was it simply cruelty, sharpened into one final taunt? Her voice memo said it all. "He thinks that mutt matters more than rent. I'm dropping it at the shelter. Let's see him cry." And cry he did. Except Marcus's tears came in the form of bullets. The detectives knew what the defense would argue: provocation. Words and deception, they'd say, had driven Marcus to the breaking point. A man pushed too far, his rational mind clouded by grief and fury. But the law does not bend easily to emotion. Provocation explains. It does not excuse. Because Marcus didn't act in an instant, blinded by a sudden impulse. He had walked into another room. He had opened a cabinet. He had armed himself. Those were choices. Deliberate. Cold. Calculated in their own way. When he returned to the living room, Sandra was unarmed. She was seated. She posed no immediate threat. And yet Marcus raised his revolver and fired 3 shots into her chest at close range. The autopsy would confirm it. 2 bullets pierced her heart and lungs. A third tore into her abdomen. The angles of the wounds matched the trajectory rods later placed in the sofa, showing she never even stood up. There were no defensive wounds on her hands, no bruises on her arms. She never tried to fight him off. Sandra's deception was cruel, but Marcus's response was lethal. Detective Price summarized it in his report. Victim engineered circumstances to create perception that household dog had been killed and cooked. Suspect reacted by retrieving firearm and shooting victim 3 times. Victim was unarmed and seated at the time. Despite provocation, conduct meets elements of homicide. In other words alone cannot justify bullets. The prosecutors agreed. While Sandra's actions might sway a jury's sympathy, they could not erase Marcus's responsibility. He had crossed the line from victim to killer the moment he pulled that trigger. And so, the case moved forward. The charge, second-degree murder, paired with felony firearm possession. For Marcus, there would be no escape from what came next. His wife was dead, his dog was alive, and his future was now bound in shackles. The question was no longer what happened. That was clear. The question now was, how would a jury weigh deception against violence? How much sympathy would Marcus win? And how much blame would he bear? The stage was set for trial. A trial that would put not just Marcus's actions under the microscope, but Sandra's cruelty as well. And in that courtroom, amid photos of bullet trajectories and soup pots, amid tears, anger, and cold facts, the truth would face its final test. January 2024. The snow fell heavy on Detroit as the trial of Marcus Grant opened inside the Wayne County Circuit Court. Reporters crowded the steps, microphones bristling, cameras flashing. The story had already gripped the city. A man who claimed his wife cooked his dog, and the murder that followed. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Jurors filed into the box, their faces tight, cautious. On one side sat the prosecution, led by Daniel Rhodes, calm but unyielding. On the other sat the defense, led by Lila Morgan, sharp-eyed and determined. And at the center, Marcus, dressed in a plain gray suit, shackles hidden beneath the table. His gaze was fixed downward, hands folded, the dog's collar no longer in his grasp. The gavel fell. The battle began. Opening statements. Prosecutor Rhodes rose first. His voice carried through the courtroom like a hammer. This is not a case of misunderstanding. This is not an accident. This is a deliberate execution. The defendant armed himself, walked back into that living room, and fired 3 rounds into his wife at close range. He did so not because she posed a threat, but because of words. Words that could never justify bullets. He laid out the story piece by piece. The soup pot, the deception, the voice memo, the dog alive in a shelter. You will see, he told the jury, that Sandra Grant's cruelty was real. But cruelty is not a death sentence. The law does not permit it. Then came defense attorney Morgan. Her tone was softer, more personal, weaving sympathy into every sentence. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not the story of a cold-blooded killer. This is the story of a man broken, pushed to the edge, humiliated and taunted until his mind fractured. He believed his only companion had been slaughtered. He believed the woman he trusted most had destroyed the only love he had left. And in that moment, Marcus Grant snapped. He acted under extreme emotional disturbance, not calculated malice. The stage was set. The jury's eyes shifted between the 2 tables, weighing every word. The evidence. The state moved first. Crime scene photos flickered across a screen. The revolver on the coffee table, the sofa stained with blood, the rods marking bullet trajectories. Jurors leaned forward, grimaces crossing their faces. Witnesses followed. Neighbors testified that they'd heard Sandra's taunts. I cooked your dog. Moments later, the sharp cracks of 3 gunshots. One neighbor broke down on the stand, whispering, "She was sitting on that couch. She never even screamed." Then came the forensic experts. Gunshot residue, positive on Marcus's hands, consistent with him firing the revolver. Trajectory analysis, bullets fired from a standing position, downward, into Sandra's chest. Autopsy, 2 fatal shots to the heart and lungs, a third through the abdomen. No defensive wounds. The soup pot was next. Lab technicians explained their analysis. The meat was beef. No canine DNA detected. Sandra had lied. And finally, the voice memo. Jurors listened as Sandra's recorded voice filled the room. He thinks that mutt matters more than rent. I'm dropping it at the shelter. Let's see him cry. The words hung heavy in the silence that followed. The dog. To drive the point home, Prosecutor Rhodes called a clerk from Detroit Animal Care. Surveillance footage showed Sandra walking into the shelter, signing paperwork, handing over Buddy. Photos were entered into evidence. The small dog alive, safe, staring through kennel bars. The jury now knew the truth. Sandra had deceived Marcus, but the dog had never been harmed. The defense. When it was their turn, defense attorney Morgan leaned hard on Sandra's cruelty. She painted her as vindictive, bitter, relentless in her taunts. She argued Marcus was not a monster, but a man whose reality collapsed in an instant. A psychologist testified that Marcus experienced a transient dissociative state, a break in rational judgment triggered by overwhelming grief and rage. In those seconds, the expert claimed, Marcus lost control of himself. And then, Marcus himself took the stand. His voice was quiet, almost hollow. He described coming home, finding the collar, hearing Sandra's words. He described the pot, the meat floating inside, the taunt echoing in his ears. She said he was in the pot, he told the jury. I believed her. I didn't need to look twice. That was enough. He did not cry. He did not plead. He simply repeated the words that had framed the entire case. She killed my dog. So I killed her. Closing arguments. Rhodes rose one final time. His tone was sharp, unrelenting. Provocation explains, but it does not excuse. The defendant had time. He had choices. He could have walked away. Instead, he armed himself. He returned. He executed his wife as she sat defenseless on that sofa. This is murder. Then Morgan, in her last attempt. Yes, Marcus fired the shots. He admits that. But do not forget what she did to him. She engineered this cruelty. She staged it to break him. And she succeeded. He is guilty, perhaps, but not of murder. He is guilty of being human, of breaking under the weight of cruelty no one should endure. The verdict. The jury deliberated for 5 hours. When they returned, the courtroom held its breath. On the charge of second-degree murder, the foreman read, "We find the defendant guilty." A collective gasp. Marcus's head dropped, eyes empty, shoulders sagging. The law had spoken. Sandra's cruelty was real, but Marcus's bullets were final. February 9, 2024. The courtroom was hushed as Judge Valerie Hughes prepared to deliver her ruling. Snow flurries drifted past tall windows, muffling the city beyond, as if even Detroit itself was holding its breath. Marcus Grant stood before the bench, hands folded, expression hollow. He had listened to every word of testimony. He had heard the recordings of his wife's voice, mocking him from beyond the grave. He had seen photos of the dog alive, proof that the entire tragedy had been built on a lie. And now he awaited his fate. Judge Hughes spoke firmly, her words deliberate, echoing off the paneled walls. Mr. Grant, the evidence has been clear. Your wife's deception was cruel beyond measure. Her words, her actions, they were designed to provoke. But cruelty does not justify homicide. Words are not a license to kill. She reminded the court that Marcus had time to think. He had choices. He left the room, retrieved a firearm, and returned to end Sandra's life while she sat defenseless. Then came the sentence. By law, 2 years consecutive for felony firearm possession. For the second-degree murder of Sandra Grant, 28 to 50 years in the Michigan Department of Corrections. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. For Marcus, it was the end. The gavel fell. His life as he knew it was over. He was led away in shackles, his eyes fixed not on the judge, not on the prosecutor, not even on the jurors who sealed his fate, but on the floor, where memory replayed endlessly. The collar in his hands, the taunt in Sandra's voice, the deafening crack of the revolver. Before leaving, Marcus spoke only once. His voice was low, almost inaudible. I thought she killed him. Judge Hughes responded without hesitation. Belief without proof does not give license to kill. And with that, Marcus was escorted out, another broken man swallowed by the prison system. Aftermath. Buddy, the dog at the heart of it all, was released into the care of Marcus's sister. Alive, healthy, oblivious to the storm of blood and lies that had swirled around his existence. Sandra's family grieved, for a daughter whose cruelty had cost her life, for a marriage that had ended in blood, for the wasted years that could never be reclaimed. Detectives Price and Stevens closed their case file. Another homicide solved, but not one they could ever forget. A case where truth was stranger, crueler, and more heartbreaking than fiction. Reflection. This was never just about a dog. It was about loneliness, about cruelty, about a marriage poisoned by resentment and silence. It was about a man so desperate for loyalty that when he believed it was taken from him, he chose violence instead of truth. Sandra's deception was a spark. Marcus's bullets were the fire. Together, they destroyed everything. And in the end, this case leaves behind a chilling reminder. Words have power, but so do choices. One woman's cruel lie, one man's irreversible decision, and a life sentence carved from 3 bullets fired on a cold October night.